Imagine standing in a city where every single building has been reduced to rubble, where the streets you once walked to school are now craters filled with frozen mud and broken bodies, where the smell of smoke has replaced the smell of bread, and where the sound of children playing has been replaced by the distant thunder of artillery that never, ever stops. Now imagine that this is not one city, but dozens, stretching across a landmass so vast that if you drove from one end of the destruction to the other without stopping, it would take you weeks. And imagine further that this landscape of total annihilation is not the work of a single battle or a single week of fighting, but the result of nearly 4 years of the most savage, relentless, industrial-scale warfare that human civilization has ever produced. A war fought not just between armies, but between entire peoples. A war in which the rules of engagement were abandoned before the first shot was fired. A war in which surrender meant slavery or death, in which capture meant starvation, in which simply being born in the wrong country, speaking the wrong language, or belonging to the wrong political class was enough to get you shot in the back of the head and buried in a ditch. And this was the Eastern Front of World War II, the largest and most lethal theater of conflict in all of recorded human history. And at the center of it stood the Soviet Union, a nation that by the time the guns finally fell silent in May of 1945 had suffered losses so incomprehensible, so staggeringly, grotesquely enormous, that historians still struggle to fully quantify them. Because the Soviet Union did not merely lose more soldiers than any other nation in the Second World War, it lost more people than every other nation in the entire conflict combined. And to understand how that happened, to truly grasp the human meaning behind numbers so large they risk becoming abstract, you have to go back to the very beginning, back to the morning of June 22nd, 1941. Back to the moment that changed the course of history and set in motion the single greatest human catastrophe of the 20th century. A moment that began not with a declaration of war, not with a diplomatic ultimatum, but with silence. And then with the sound of 3 million German soldiers crossing the Soviet border simultaneously along a front stretching nearly 2,000 miles. And what followed was not simply a military invasion. It was the opening act of a war of annihilation, deliberately designed from the very beginning not to defeat the Soviet Union as a political entity, but to destroy it as a civilization, to enslave its people, to steal its land, and to erase from the earth the idea that Slavic peoples had any right to exist as anything other than laborers in service of a German empire. And to understand the scale of Soviet losses, you must first understand that this intention was not a secret, not something discovered after the war in captured documents, but something that Adolf Hitler and his generals openly discussed, planned for, and systematically implemented from the very first days of the campaign. Because what the Wehrmacht carried with it across the Soviet border in the summer of 1941 was not just tanks and artillery and infantry. It carried the Commissar Order, a directive that instructed German soldiers to execute Soviet political officers on the spot rather than take them prisoner. It carried the guidelines for the treatment of Soviet war prisoners that effectively sentenced millions of captured soldiers to death by starvation and exposure. And it carried the operational logic of the Hunger Plan, a deliberate policy developed by Nazi economic planners to extract food from Soviet-occupied territories and redirect it to Germany, knowing full well that this would cause the starvation of tens of millions of Soviet civilians. And so, from the very moment the invasion began, the Soviet Union was not fighting a war in any conventional sense. It was fighting for its literal physical survival against an enemy that had already decided it had no right to exist. And the Soviet people would pay for this in blood on a scale that the human mind genuinely struggles to comprehend. Because the first shock of Operation Barbarossa alone was catastrophic beyond any precedent in modern military history.
with entire Soviet army groups encircled and destroyed in the opening weeks of the campaign, with hundreds of thousands of soldiers captured in single engagements, with the Red Army losing more men in the first 6 months of the war than the United States would lose in the entire conflict across every theater combined. And yet, even these staggering early losses were only the beginning of a cascade of death that would continue for nearly 4 years without pause. And to understand why the losses climbed so high, you have to understand several things simultaneously. Because the Soviet catastrophe was not the result of a single cause, but of an overlapping, mutually reinforcing series of factors that each made the others worse. Beginning with the nature of the ideology driving the German war machine, continuing through the specific military and geographic circumstances of the Eastern Front, moving through the particular character of Soviet leadership and the decisions made by Joseph Stalin, and ending with the fundamental reality that the Soviet Union was the only nation in the entire conflict that faced the full, undivided maximum weight of Nazi Germany's military power for the majority of the war. And let us begin with the ideology, because without understanding what the Nazis believed about the Soviet people, it is impossible to understand why the death toll climbed so obscenely high. Because the Wehrmacht's treatment of Soviet POWs alone accounts for one of the largest single categories of death in the entire war, with historians estimating that between 3.3 and 3.7 million Soviet soldiers died in German captivity, a number that exceeds the total military deaths of the United States, Britain, and France in the entire Second World War put together. And these men did not die in battle. They died of deliberate starvation, of exposure in open-air camps with no shelter during the catastrophic Russian winters, of disease in conditions of manufactured squalor, of summary execution for any perceived infraction, and of the simple, direct, explicit policy decision made in Berlin that Soviet prisoners were racially subhuman and therefore not entitled to the protections of the Geneva Convention, a decision that had no parallel in the treatment of Western Allied prisoners and that reflected the fundamental Nazi conviction that the war in the East was a different kind of war entirely, a racial war, a war in which the normal rules of civilized conflict simply did not apply. And this ideology cascaded downward from the highest levels of German command into the behavior of ordinary soldiers in ways that multiplied the killing exponentially. Because soldiers who had been told that their enemy was not fully human, that the Slavic peoples were Untermenschen, subhumans, were soldiers who killed with less hesitation, who left the wounded to die, who looked the other way when the SS executed entire villages, and who participated in or tolerated atrocities that soldiers fighting in the Western theater would have found unthinkable. And the consequences of this ideological framework were felt not just by soldiers, but by every single Soviet civilian who found themselves on the wrong side of the front line. Because the German occupation of Soviet territory was administered on the explicit assumption that the local population was both racially inferior and politically dangerous, which meant that occupation policy was characterized not by the kind of relative normalcy that characterized German occupation of Western Europe, but by systematic terror, mass murder, deliberate starvation, forced labor, and the wholesale destruction of entire communities. And nowhere was this more visible or more lethal than in the treatment of the Soviet Jewish population, which constituted one of the largest Jewish communities in the world, and which was targeted for total extermination from the very first days of the occupation, with the SS mobile killing units following directly behind the advancing Wehrmacht and systematically murdering every Jewish man, woman, and child they could find, shooting them into mass graves at places like Babi Yar outside Kyiv, where in just 2 days in September of 1941, more than 33,000 people were murdered, a rate of killing so rapid and so comprehensive that it shocked even some SS officers who had been specifically selected for their ideological commitment to the task. And across the occupied Soviet territories, the total number of Jewish victims ran into the millions, forming a significant portion of the total Soviet civilian death toll that historians now estimate at somewhere between 15 and 17 million people, a number of civilian deaths that dwarfs every other nation's total losses, military and civilian combined, in the entire war. And yet even this does not fully capture the nature of Soviet suffering, because the civilians who were not murdered outright faced conditions that amounted to a slow-motion death sentence, with entire cities subjected to prolonged sieges deliberately designed to starve their populations into submission or extinction, most notoriously at Leningrad, where nearly 900 days of German encirclement created conditions of such extreme starvation that people ate wallpaper paste, leather belts, and in documented cases resorted to cannibalism simply to survive. Where the official ration for non-working civilians at the siege's worst point in the winter of 1941 amounted to 125 grams of bread per day, bread that was frequently adulterated with sawdust and cellulose, and where an estimated 800,000 civilians died, more people than the United States lost in both the Pacific and European theaters of the entire war.
Leningrad was not an exception, but a pattern, because the German conduct of the war in the East consistently and deliberately used the starvation of civilian populations as a weapon, redirecting agricultural production from occupied territories to Germany and leaving local populations to survive on what remained, were deaths to an already incomprehensible total.
Through all of this, you must never lose sight of the geographic and demographic reality of what the Soviet Union was. Because part of what made the losses so enormous is simply that the Soviet Union was the largest country in the world with one of the largest populations. And the war was fought across its most densely populated and economically vital regions, meaning that the territory over which the armies surged back and forth, from the border to the outskirts of Moscow, down to Stalingrad on the Oba, across Ukraine and Byelorussia and the Baltic states, was territory containing hundreds of millions of people, and virtually every one of those people was touched by the war in ways that ranged from displacement and destitution to outright death.
And the Red Army's losses must be understood in this context too, because the army that fought this war was itself an expression of Soviet society in its totality, a mass army that at its peak mobilized over 11 million men under arms simultaneously, that drafted soldiers as young as 17 and as old as 50, that threw men into battle with equipment shortages, training deficiencies, and tactical doctrines still being reinvented in real time under combat conditions, and which suffered military disasters of a scale and frequency that would have broken the will of any other nation on Earth, with the encirclement battles of 1941 alone at Kyiv, Vyazma, Bryansk, and Minsk, resulting in the capture or death of more than 3 million Soviet soldiers in just the first 5 months of the war, losses so severe that they essentially destroyed the pre-war Red Army and forced the Soviet state to rebuild its military from near scratch while simultaneously fighting for its survival.
And here is where the character of Soviet leadership becomes inseparable from the story of Soviet losses. Because Joseph Stalin is simultaneously one of the most important reasons the Soviet Union survived the war, and one of the most important reasons the Soviet Union lost so many people die in it. And the contradiction is not resolvable because both things are equally true. Because Stalin's purge of the Red Army Officer Corps in 1937 and 1938, which resulted in the execution or imprisonment of approximately 35,000 officers, including 3 of the 5 marshals, the majority of corps and division commanders, and enormous numbers of regimental and battalion officers, left the Red Army in 1941 commanded at the upper levels by a combination of men promoted too quickly to fill the purge's vacancies and survivors who had learned the cardinal lesson of Stalinist military culture, that showing initiative, disagreeing with superiors, or delivering bad news could be more dangerous to your career and your life than the enemy's bullets. And this culture of fear and institutional paralysis contributed directly to the catastrophic failures of the opening months of the war,
because Soviet commanders who recognized the signs of the impending German attack frequently failed to act on that knowledge or failed to communicate it upward. And when the attack came, units that might have retreated to more defensible positions were ordered to hold ground at all costs, not because holding that ground was militarily sensible, but because Stalin had decided that tactical retreat was a sign of cowardice or treason. And men died by the hundreds of thousands enforcing a military doctrine driven by political ideology rather than tactical reality. And Stalin's direct interventions in military operations, which were frequent throughout the war's early years, contributed to multiple major disasters, including the catastrophic encirclement at Kharkov in May of 1942, where his insistence on continuing an offensive that his generals told him was failing led to the encirclement and destruction of an entire Soviet army group and the death or capture of over 200,000 men. This pattern of military decision-making distorted by political fear, of lives spent to satisfy ideological requirements rather than military necessity, of soldiers ordered to attack without adequate support or retreat without adequate cover, ran through the entire Soviet war effort and added a dimension of preventable death to an already catastrophic situation. And yet you cannot tell this story honestly without acknowledging the other side of that equation, which is that the same Stalin whose decisions killed hundreds of thousands of his own soldiers also made decisions that ultimately saved the Soviet state. That the evacuation of Soviet industry eastward beyond the Ural Mountains in the summer and autumn of 1941, a logistical operation of staggering complexity that moved over 1,500 entire factories and millions of workers to safety, was accomplished under his direction and represented one of the decisive strategic moves of the entire war. That his refusal to allow Moscow to fall in December of 1941, when the city was genuinely in danger, his decision to remain in the capital when the government and diplomatic corps were evacuating, and his authorization of the counteroffensive that pushed the Germans back from the Moscow suburbs were all critical to preventing a Soviet collapse that would have ended the war on terms that would have made the actual death toll look modest by comparison. And the dark, terrible truth at the heart of Soviet losses is that the victory which ultimately came was purchased at a price that no democratic society could have paid, because the Soviet Union's ability to sustain losses that would have caused any other nation to seek terms was inseparable from the nature of the Soviet state itself, from its capacity to compel sacrifice through a combination of genuine patriotism, nationalist fervor, legitimate terror of what German occupation meant, and the coercive machinery of a totalitarian government that treated military failure as a capital crime. And Order 227, Stalin's July 1942 directive titled "Not One Step Back," which formalized the use of blocking detachments stationed behind Soviet lines with orders to shoot soldiers who retreated without authorization, was both a symptom of this system and a reflection of the desperation it was responding to. Because by the summer of 1942, the German summer offensive had pushed deep into the Don Bend and was driving towards Stalingrad and the Caucasus oil fields. The Soviet Union was genuinely, existentially close to defeat, and the measures taken to prevent that defeat were measures that cost Soviet lives while saving the Soviet state. And the moral calculus of that exchange is one that historians will debate for as long as history is written. But what is not debatable is the consequence, which was that the Soviet Union kept fighting when no other calculus of rational national interest could have justified the continuation of the struggle. And the cumulative effect of 4 years of fighting at that intensity, at that scale, with those losses, was a demographic wound so deep that the Soviet Union was still counting its dead decades after the war ended, still discovering mass graves, still revising its casualty figures upward.
and the numbers that Soviet authorities themselves acknowledged publicly during the Soviet era, presented for decades as approximately 20 million dead, were themselves almost certainly an undercount, driven by the political sensitivity of admitting the full scale of the catastrophe. And post-Soviet research, drawing on newly opened archives and more sophisticated demographic reconstruction methods, has revised the total Soviet death toll upward to estimates ranging from 26 million to as high as 27 million people, with some researchers arguing for figures higher still. And to understand what 27 million means in human terms, you have to scale it against something comprehensible. So consider that 27 million is more than the current population of Australia, more than the populations of the Netherlands and Belgium combined, more than 8 times the total number of Americans killed in every war the United States has ever fought, from the Revolution to the present day, more than the entire Jewish death toll of the Holocaust, itself the most documented genocide in history, multiplied by nearly 5. And consider that these 27 million deaths were not spread evenly across the Soviet population, but were concentrated overwhelmingly among young men of fighting age and among the civilian populations of the Western Soviet territories, meaning that the demographic impact was not simply a reduction in total population, but a catastrophic distortion of the population's age and gender structure that would take generations to fully correct. Because the Soviet Union that emerged from the Second World War was a nation in which women outnumbered men in the 20 to 35 age cohort by margins that in some regions approached 2-to-1, in which entire villages had lost every male between the ages of 18 and 40, in which the generation that would have been the economic and social backbone of the post-war decades had been erased from the earth. And the consequences of this demographic catastrophe echoed forward through Soviet history for decades, shaping everything from the post-war labor shortage to birth rates to the psychology of an entire people. Because the Soviet Union that emerged from the war was a society that had been traumatized at a depth and on a scale that no other modern nation had experienced. A society in which virtually every family had lost someone, in which the experience of catastrophic loss was not a shared trauma in the abstract sense, but a lived reality embedded in the personal histories of nearly every citizen. And it is worth pausing here to make real what the statistics mean at the level of individual human experience, because behind every number in this story is a person, a life that was lived and then ended. And Soviet losses were not simply a matter of soldiers dying in battle. They encompassed the young lieutenant from Leningrad who died in the first week of Barbarossa before he had even seen his newborn child. And the collective farm worker in Ukraine who watched German soldiers shoot her husband in the yard of their home and then spent 2 years in forced labor before dying of typhus in the winter of 1943. And the 12-year-old boy in Belarus who survived the massacre of his entire village by lying still under the bodies of his family members and who grew up to never speak of what he had seen. And the Red Army sergeant from Kazakhstan who fought from Stalingrad to Berlin and who came home to find that his entire family had starved to death during the occupation. And the Jewish doctor from Odessa who was shot into a mass grave outside the city in October of 1941, along with 25,000 of his neighbors over the course of just 3 days. And millions more, each one a universe of experience and memory and love and grief that was simply extinguished. And the sheer accumulation of these individual extinguishments is what the number 27 million means. And it is a number that the world has never fully reckoned with, in part because the Cold War created a political context in which Soviet suffering was an uncomfortable fact for Western narratives about the war. Narratives that emphasized the Western Allied contribution to victory and were structurally resistant to acknowledging that the Soviet Union had borne the overwhelming share of the military burden against Nazi Germany. Because the numbers here are unambiguous and striking. Of the approximately 10 million German and Axis military personnel killed in the Second World War, approximately 8 million were killed on the Eastern Front fighting the Soviet Union, meaning that Soviet forces were responsible for killing roughly 80% of all German military casualties in the entire war. Meaning that D-Day and the Western campaigns, for all their genuine importance and genuine sacrifice, represented a secondary theater in terms of the raw military killing that destroyed the Wehrmacht.
And this is not a diminishment of the Western Allied sacrifice, which was real and significant, but it is an essential corrective to a historical memory that has often presented the war as primarily a Western Allied victory achieved with Soviet assistance, rather than what it actually was, a Soviet war of survival, in which Western Allied support, while critically important, was secondary to the colossal effort of the Red Army and the Soviet people. And understanding this requires understanding the Eastern Front not as a single continuous campaign, but as a series of overlapping catastrophes, each of which would alone qualify as the defining military experience of any nation that endured it. From the summer disasters of 1941 through the siege of Leningrad and the battle for Moscow in the winter of that year, through the spring and summer of 1942 and the German drive towards Stalingrad, through the Battle of Stalingrad itself, 200 days of combat in the ruins of a single city that killed roughly 2 million people on both sides and stands as perhaps the most lethal single battle in human history, through the enormous armored clash at Kursk in the summer of 1943 that broke the last significant German offensive capability in the east, through the grinding Soviet offensives of 1943 and 1944 that pushed the Germans back across the entire front, through Operation Barbarossa in the summer of 1944 that destroyed Army Group Center and inflicted on Germany in a single operation losses comparable to the entire German defeat at Stalingrad, and through the final drive to Berlin in 1945 that cost the Soviet Union additional hundreds of thousands of casualties even when victory was already assured, because the Red Army fought every one of these campaigns with an intensity and a disregard for casualties that reflected both the existential nature of what was at stake and the specific military culture of an army that had learned to accept staggering losses as the cost of doing business in the most violent military environment in history. And when the war finally ended, when Soviet soldiers raised their flag over the Reichstag in Berlin in May of 1945, the victory was real, and it was hard won, and it was purchased at a price that the Soviet people understood with an intimacy that no victory speech or parade could adequately acknowledge, because the veterans who came home to a country that was simultaneously celebrating the greatest military achievement in Russian history and grieving on a scale that had no precedent, came home to villages where there were no men, to cities where the rubble had not yet been cleared, to families that were absent, to a landscape of loss so total and so comprehensive that the rebuilding of the physical country was in some ways easier than the rebuilding of the human fabric that had been torn apart.
And the Soviet state's response to this grief was, characteristically, to try to control and redirect it, to channel the enormity of the loss into a narrative of heroic sacrifice and inevitable victory that served the political needs of the regime, to build monuments and hold parades and declare May 9th a day of celebration rather than mourning, and to simultaneously suppress and deny the parts of the Soviet war experience that complicated that narrative. The mass surrenders of 1941, the failures of Soviet leadership, the fate of the millions of soldiers who had been captured and who came home, if they came home at all, under suspicion of collaboration or cowardice. The experience of the Soviet citizens who had lived under German occupation and who found themselves regarded with suspicion by a state that viewed having survived occupation as inherently suspicious, and the experience of the peoples like the Chechens and the Crimean Tatars, who were collectively deported from their homelands on Stalin's orders during the war on accusations of collaboration, deportations that themselves killed hundreds of thousands of people, and that added a layer of Soviet-inflicted death to the already catastrophic German-inflicted losses.
And all of this complexity, All of this darkness within the darkness is part of what the number 27 million contains, part of what it means to reckon honestly with the question of why the Soviet Union lost more people than every other nation combined.
Because the answer is not simple. It is not reducible to a single cause or a single villain or a single decision. It is the product of an ideology that designated an entire civilization for destruction, of a geography that made the Soviet Union the unavoidable center of the greatest land war in history, of a military culture shaped by the particular brutalities of Stalinist governance, of the sheer scale of a nation so enormous that the war touched virtually every corner of it and virtually every person within it, and of a kind of suffering so total and so prolonged that it permanently altered the character of an entire people. And perhaps the most important thing to understand about Soviet losses, the thing that gets lost most easily in the abstraction of statistics, is that they were not inevitable. That the decisions made in Berlin in the late 1930s and early 1940s, the decision to invade, the decision to conduct the invasion as a war of racial annihilation rather than a conventional military campaign, the decision to starve prisoners rather than feed them, the decision to murder civilians rather than administer them, each of those decisions added millions to the death toll.
And the decisions made in Moscow contributed too. The purges of the officer corps, the dismissal of intelligence warnings, the insistence on holding ground rather than conducting elastic defense, the blocking detachments, the indifference to casualty rates that treated soldiers as expendable resources rather than irreplaceable human beings. Each of those decisions added to the toll as well.
And what remains when you lay all of those decisions alongside each other is the portrait of a catastrophe that was simultaneously the product of ideology and geography and contingency and human failure on the most epic scale imaginable. And what also remains, and what perhaps matters most, is the memory of the people who died. The 27 million who did not come home, the soldiers and the civilians and the prisoners and the besieged and the occupied and the executed and the starved, who between them represent the largest single toll of human life exacted by any conflict in the history of the world. And whose deaths shaped the Soviet Union that emerged from the war, shaped the Cold War that followed it, shaped the Russia that exists today with its particular relationship to the memory of that conflict and to the sacrifices it demanded. Because you cannot understand Russia without understanding this war, cannot understand the particular intensity with which Russian society commemorates May 9th, cannot understand the deep Russian sensitivity about the integrity of its borders and the security of its Western approaches, cannot understand the way the war lives in Russian cultural memory as something simultaneously more present and more painful than anything comparable in the experience of Western nations, without reckoning with the full weight of what those 27 million deaths mean. And what they mean ultimately is this: that the Soviet Union won the Second World War the way a person survives a fire, by crawling through the flames on their hands and knees, badly burned, barely alive, having lost everything except the life itself, and that the fire through which it crawled was the Eastern Front, the most lethal theater of the most lethal war in human history, and the burns it left behind were so deep and so extensive that they never fully healed. And perhaps the truest thing that can be said about Soviet losses in the Second World War is not a number, not a statistic, not a comparison, but simply this: that what happened to the Soviet people between 1941 and 1945 was something that the human capacity for suffering should never have been tested to endure. And that the fact that it was endured, and that the people who endured it still found the will to fight and ultimately to prevail, is one of the most extraordinary and most terrible facts in the entire history of human conflict.